In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to set up an SPSS data file that contains variables of different types. So the data that we are going to import or actually input into SPSS is contained in this table right here. And each column contains a different variable. And so the variable names are listed in the top column, the top row, if you will, and then the values on those variables fall underneath within each of their respective columns. So really quickly, the variable names are ID, and this is just an identifier for, let's say, a student who has responded to several survey measures. So we have IDs of 1 to 10, basically students 1 to 10. And then we also have a variable that's called gender ID. So this is self-identified gender as being either male or female. It's coded 0 for male and 1 for female. And this variable is a nominal variable, meaning that the values can't be rank ordered, and the values on the variable just reflect differences on the characteristics. So in terms of gender ID, we have two values that are being represented: self-identified male, self-identified female. The ed level variable is essentially an ordinal variable, and it's coded 1 freshman, 2 equals sophomore, 3 equals junior, and 4 equals senior. So this is an ordinal variable, and the values on this particular variable reflect a rank ordering in terms of the educational level of an individual. So if these were college students, just keep in mind the 1, 2, 3, and 4 don't necessarily have to refer to year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. We're actually referring to the designation as freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior. And it is conceivable that you could have freshmen who are in year 2, but they haven't reached a certain hour amount, and so they're still designated as freshmen, and so forth. So at any rate, ed level is an ordinal variable. Our efficacy variable right here is also being treated as an ordinal variable, where it's coded 0 is low and 1 is high. So efficacy for learning stats, a person might have responded either I'm low in my efficacy for learning stats or high in efficacy for learning stats. And so in this case, we're just talking about efficacy in terms of just a general ordering or rank ordering in terms of the characteristic. So that would also be an ordinal variable. Then we have interest in learning stats, and this is an interval variable, and it ranges between 1 being extremely low to 9 being extremely high. And so with an interval scale variable, what we're talking about is the amount of the characteristic of interest, that being interest in learning stats. The difference between an interval scale variable and an ordinal variable is that equal differences between adjacent points on the scale reflect an equal difference in the amount of the characteristic that you are measuring. So for instance, if I have 2 people, one person has a score of 1 on the interest scale and another person who has a score of 2, the difference between those of 1 unit equals the difference in the amount of interest as seen between, say, a person who has a score of 8 and a person who has a score of 9, or a person who has a score of 3 and a person who has a score of 4. So that's essentially what the interval variable is capturing, and so interest is our interval variable. We also have 2 ratio level variables, and basically with ratio level variables, they also reflect the amount of a characteristic that's being measured, but they also incorporate an absolute 0 point. So a value of 0 on those variables would reflect the absence of the characteristic. So this is different from an interval scale variable, where a value of 0, if it appears within the scale, it's essentially an arbitrary scale point and doesn't reflect the absence of a characteristic. So for instance, if we go back to our interest variable, where we had a value of 1 reflecting extremely low interest, a value of 9 reflecting extremely high, if we had set up our scale a little differently, let's say we had value of -4 to a value of +4, where a 0 falls in between. Then basically 0 would be an arbitrary midpoint. It would not reflect the absence of a characteristic, that being interest in learning of stats. So that's essentially the difference between an interval scale variable and a ratio scale variable, is that with a ratio scale variable, a value of 0 would reflect the absence of the characteristic. So we have two ratio level variables in our data set. One is courses, which is referring to the number of previous stat courses taken. This is a discrete ratio variable where it reflects a certain account. And so the values will range between 0, and positive infinity theoretically, but the number of courses obviously can't be that high. So, but as you can see, we essentially have courses reflecting counts. So this person had a 0 count in terms of the number of stat courses. This person had 2, this person had 3, a count of 1, and so forth. The height variable we're going to treat more as a continuous ratio variable, where theoretically a height of 0 would reflect the complete absence of height. And given the precision of measurement, we're measuring in millimeters, we could treat this as reasonably like a continuous measure as well. So at any rate, we're going to type this information into SPSS and go from there. So I've gone back to the SPSS data file. At the bottom, you'll notice you've got a little toggle between data view and variable view. So to set up our variables, we're going to go to variable view, and under name, we'll type in our variable names. And so I'll type in ID, then I'll type in gender ID. And one thing is you can't have spaces in the name. So if I try to type this in as gender space ID, you can hear that it doesn't work. So you can't have spaces in there. So I'm just going to type, so I could either type in gender ID right here, or I could use something a little different. I could say gender and then underscore ID, that will work too, or a period or whatever. So at any rate, that's just kind of FYI. Next, we'll type in ed level, so ED level right here, then efficacy here, interest here, courses, and height. All right, so notice that as we type in the variable names, a number of defaults fill in, and you can see that where it says type, the default is numeric. You also see that in terms of decimals, it defaults at 2. We can change those as we want, and then some others. And then over here you got measure, and so this is where we can lay out what type of scale of measurement that we're working with. So also note that you can actually include string variables in here, but you have to set the type for that. So before I do show you anything with that, I'm just going to go to the. You'll notice that there's actually a little button that's kind of hidden on the right side of these little cells here. So I'm going to click right here, and you can see that for variable type it defaults with numeric, and then there are various types that can be listed, and there's string down here if we wanted to type in a variable that contained names of some sort. We could certainly do that. So we have defaults numeric. If I want to reset the decimal places, I can go over here, and you can see that you can kind of toggle up and down and change the number of decimal places if you want to do that. So you'll notice too that we have a little label column right here. This is where you can give a little bit more descriptive label for your variables if you want. Like if I want to call this, say, gender identification, educational level in college, something like that, I can get that. The one downside is that these labels start appearing in your output when you're running your analyses. And so if you have really long labels, it can get a little bit unwieldy in terms of finding what you're looking for just because it's so long. The values option right here, this is if you want to have certain value labels show up in your output, and this is really handy. In particular, I use this a lot when I'm working with categorical variables, and so I'll show you a bit of that. This column right here, the missing, this is how, this is basically setting it up for how you want to deal with missing data. A lot of times when people are entering data into the spreadsheet, they may, if there's a missing value on a variable, they may leave the cell blank. But then you're sort of left with the question later on. You might not necessarily know whether the blank reflects a true missing value or if there was an error, like if you were key punching and you inadvertently hit the tab or the arrow key and you failed to put a number in there. So you could establish a code for SPSS to recognize when it's carrying out the data analyses to treat that observation as missing. Under measure, like I said, we can set the scales of measurement for our variables. And so let's go to gender ID. So I'm going to go to the right of this box here, and you can see I've got scale, ordinal, and nominal. So we were treating gender ID as a nominal variable, so I'm just going to click on that. For ed level, I'm going to click on ordinal. For efficacy, we're going to treat that as ordinal. For interest, I'm going to treat as scale variable here. And then I can do the same for our two ratio variables. So scale is kind of a designation for interval or ratio level variables, whereas nominal and ordinal are a little bit more distinctive in how that's set up in the program. So next, what we'll do is let's set up our value labels for gender ID, educational level, and efficacy. So I'm going to go over here to values for gender ID. I'm going to click on here, and I'll type in a value of 0 in the value box, and then a label, I'll give it a 1. And then you can either hit enter or add, and then we'll do 1 and then female. And then click on OK. And so now you can see that the values are kind of appearing in this little box. Then for ed level, I'll type in a value of 1, then freshman, 2 for sophomore, 3 for junior, and 4 for senior. And click on OK. And then for efficacy, we'll say a value of 0 will be low efficacy, value of 1 for high efficacy. And there you go. And I could theoretically set it up the same way with interest or some of these other variables, but I typically don't do much with that. So now I've gone back and forth. This is again variable view and data view. And so now what we'll do is we'll type in our values. So under ID, this is essentially you can see it's already kind of defaulting as a scale variable. It's I could leave it that or really I'm just going to stick with the default. So because typically I don't use the case identifier in any kind of analyses. This is just a lot of times when we are putting data into a data set, we might have a case number to reflect the individual observation. If we wanted to go back and know what if there was a missing value or there was an error or something like that, we might want to know the observation number. So I'm just putting that in here. And you'll notice that as we're putting in the values, the rows, each row is highlighting, and in this case the ID is consistent with the number within the rows. But let's say I had this person, I'd given an ID number of 25, and this person an ID number of 45 or whatever. It doesn't matter, but that's just kind of a little extra to pay attention to. So at any rate, there's 7, there's 8, but kind of fix that back. Now for gender ID, we're going to type in the value. So I'm going to put in 0, 0. Those are 2 males. Then we have 2 females, a male, female, and then we have 3 more males, and then a value of 1 for female. So those are the values that are in this column right here. Then we have ed level. We'll put in those values. So 1, 3, 2, 4, 1, 1, 3, 2, 3, 1. And then we'll just do the same for the others. Okay, so now I've got the data entered. And next, what we're going to do is just take a quick look at some of the missing data options. So, as I said before, under variable view, you can see the missing column. It starts off, the default is none. And what I want to do is show you what happens if you have missing data. So let's say let's say I had missing data for case number 9 on the gender variable. And let's say we had a missing value for case number 4 on the ed level variable. So now, right now, if I run the analysis, SPSS will treat these missing values as missing. So the empty cells will be treated as missing. So to show you what happens, I'll go to Analyze, and I'll just run frequencies for both of these variables. So I'll put gender ID over in here, as well as ed level, and then click on OK. And so you can see that what we end up with is you can see the frequencies. There's male, there's female, and then it says missing system 1. So you'll notice then that we also have valid percentages based on the actual counts. So these percentages are assuming 9 complete data points, and then the cumulative percentages are essentially reflecting that. The missing system percentage right here, this is the percentage of missing cases on that particular variable. So then if I scroll down, you can see that with the ed level variable, the same basic idea. There's the missing system value of 1. So at any rate, you can see, oops, you can see that, I'm just going to click that off. You can see right here that, let's say I add in another missing data point just to kind of really drive this home. So I'm going to add in 2 right there on ed level and rerun it to show you what happens. So in this particular case, you can see now where it says missing system, there were 3 missing data points, and that was actually constitutes 30% of the cases in our data file. So remember that it's essentially reflecting the number of rows that we have available. So that's, we have 30% of the possible values on ed level are missing. So at any rate, now, let's say, for instance, that I'm typing in a large set of data, and it's possible that I could have empty cells because I've, failed to enter something in. One way around this problem is when I'm entering the data, I could assign a missing value code. So theoretically, if I click on ed level, and by the way, I can go back and forth between the little toggles also by clicking on a given variable at the top of the column under the data view. So I can do that. And then I might say under missing, I can click at the end of the right side of the cell here. And you can see it says no missing values. And if I want to assign a missing value code, then I can just type in discrete missing values, and I can type in some value that is clearly not within the range of values that that I've assigned for the other levels on the variable. So I could type in something like 999, which is not anywhere within the realm of codes that I would have for that particular variable. So I could do that, then click on OK, and then under data view, and I think I did that under XC. So I'm going to go back to no missing values, and I'll do this under ed level here. And in this case, now when I click on, if I was typing this in, I could type in 999 to reflect that that is a missing value. So you can see then that when I ask for the frequencies for this, you can see that it's listed below as missing 999. There's that frequency count for that one missing value for the ed level variable. So if I didn't do that and I just leave a blank space and I just get missing system, and you can see that there's a frequency under that gender ID variable. So it's really kind of up to you as to how you want to deal with the missing data. If there's a higher likelihood that you are going to have, if you're entering in a lot more data by hand, or there's a high likelihood that you could end up with blank cells because of a data entry error, then it might be worthwhile to incorporate a missing value code so that the program will recognize it, and you will too if you go back and you are trying to figure out what went wrong with your data analysis, if there was some kind of weirdness with it. If if you're doing a smaller data set like this, then really probably leaving the blank spaces might be okay. So at any rate, that's pretty well covers what I wanted to cover for this particular video. Basically, if you want to save the data file, you just go up to File, Save As, and then you just basically find a location and save it. I'm just saving this under an old path, and there you go. So then I've just saved it as descriptives. So that pretty well concludes this discussion.